Mrs. Evelyn was a kind, elderly woman who lived in a quiet neighborhood. She was in her 70s but still full of life and energy. Her silver hair framed a face that always wore a gentle smile. Evelyn had spent most of her life as a schoolteacher, helping children learn and grow. Now retired, she spent her days gardening, baking, and walking her beloved dog, Max. Max was no ordinary dog. He was a large German shepherd with shiny black and tan fur and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand everything. Evelyn had adopted him from a rescue shelter a year ago. The shelter staff had told her that Max had once been a police dog, trained to protect and serve. He had been retired after an injury, and now he needed a loving home. From the moment Evelyn met Max, she knew he was special. Max wasn't just a pet. He was her protector, her companion, and her friend. Every morning, they would go for a walk together, rain or shine. Evelyn loved these walks because they gave her a chance to enjoy the fresh air and greet her neighbors. Max loved them too, always staying close to her side, his sharp eyes watching everything around them. Evelyn's neighborhood was a mix of people from different backgrounds. Most of her neighbors were friendly, waving and chatting with her as she passed. But lately, Evelyn had noticed a change. Some people didn't seem as kind as they used to be. They would stare at her and mutter things under their breath. She didn't let it bother her too much, though. Evelyn had faced many challenges in her life, and she wasn't going to let a few unfriendly faces ruin her peace. Max seemed to sense her mood. Whenever she felt uneasy, he would lean against her leg or give her a reassuring look. It was as if he was saying, "Don't worry, I'm here." Evelyn often wondered what Max had experienced during his time as a police dog. He had a calm confidence about him, like he had seen it all and knew exactly how to handle any situation. One sunny afternoon, Evelyn decided to take Max to the park. It was her favorite place to relax and enjoy nature. The trees were tall and green, and the sound of birds singing made her feel at peace. She packed a small bag with a bottle of water and a few dog treats for Max. As they stepped out of her house, Max wagged his tail happily, ready for another adventure. What Evelyn didn't know was that this walk would be different from all the others. Something unexpected was about to happen, something that would remind everyone just how special Max truly was. Evelyn and Max walked side by side, unaware of the events waiting for them just around the corner. Evelyn and Max walked peacefully along the quiet streets of their neighborhood. The sun was warm, the air was fresh, and Max's tail wagged with excitement as he sniffed at every bush and tree. For Evelyn, these walks were a daily reminder of life's small joys. She felt safe with Max by her side, his steady presence giving her comfort. However, things in the community weren't as calm as they used to be. Evelyn had noticed subtle changes over the past few months. Some of her neighbors, who used to smile and greet her warmly, now avoided her or gave her strange looks. It wasn't everyone. Many were still kind and friendly, but there was an undercurrent of tension that she couldn't ignore. Evelyn had always believed in treating people with kindness, no matter what. She hoped that her cheerful waves and polite greetings would remind others to be kind too. But sometimes she would overhear whispers or feel the sting of someone's cold stare. These moments hurt, but she tried not to dwell on them. Max, on the other hand, seemed to sense everything. Whenever someone gave Evelyn a rude glance, Max would stiffen slightly, his ears perking up as if he were ready to protect her. Evelyn would pat his head and reassure him, saying, "It's all right, Max. Let's keep walking." Max would relax, but his watchful eyes never missed a thing. That day, the park was unusually quiet. Evelyn and Max walked along the familiar path, enjoying the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. She loved how peaceful the park was, especially on weekday afternoons when most people were at work or school. It was her favorite place to clear her mind and appreciate the beauty of nature. As they strolled deeper into the park, Evelyn noticed a group of young men sitting on a bench near the entrance. They were talking loudly and laughing, their voices carrying across the open space. Evelyn didn't recognize them, but she gave them a polite nod as she passed by. The men didn't return her gesture. Instead, one of them made a comment that she couldn't quite hear, followed by laughter from the others. Evelyn felt a twinge of unease but decided to ignore it. She focused on Max, who was sniffing the grass and wagging his tail. "Let's go, Max," she said softly, leading him further down the path. As they continued their walk, Evelyn tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling. She reminded herself that she had every right to enjoy the park, just like anyone else. Max seemed to sense her unease, staying closer to her side and glancing back toward the men. Little did Evelyn know, the group of men hadn't forgotten her. They exchanged looks and stood up from the bench, their laughter fading as they began to follow her. Evelyn was about to face a situation she never expected, but she wasn't alone. Max was there, and he was more than ready to protect her if needed. Evelyn and Max were walking down the winding path of the park, the soft sound of Max's paws against the earth filling the air. Evelyn took a deep breath, enjoying the fresh air and the calm of the trees around her. She had always loved this part of the park, where the trees met the edge of the stream, creating a peaceful and serene setting. She could hear the gentle rustling of the leaves in the wind, and it helped her feel connected to nature. But today, the park seemed different. There was an uneasy feeling hanging in the air. As they continued walking, Evelyn couldn't shake the sensation that someone was watching her. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the group of young men from the bench following them. They were walking at a steady pace, not hurrying, but their eyes were fixed on her. Evelyn felt her heart race a little. "Don't worry, Max," she murmured, trying to calm herself as she petted her dog's head. "We'll just keep going." Max gave a soft whine, as if sensing her discomfort. He moved closer to her, keeping his head high and his eyes scanning the surroundings. Max had always been protective, and Evelyn trusted him completely. She tried to push aside the feeling of unease, telling herself it was nothing. The path ahead began to narrow, and the trees seemed to grow closer together, creating a more enclosed space. It was a peaceful spot, but today it felt different. The men were getting closer. They were still talking among themselves, but now their voices had become louder, more noticeable. One of the men called out to her, "Hey, lady," he shouted, his voice harsh. Evelyn kept walking, keeping her head forward. She didn't want to encourage any trouble, but she couldn't ignore them either. "Keep walking, Max," Evelyn said quietly, urging her dog forward. She didn't want to make a scene, but she also didn't want to be intimidated. The men quickened their pace, matching her steps. Evelyn's heart began to race. She could feel the tension in the air as they came closer. She knew something wasn't right, but she couldn't understand why they were following her. One of the men stepped in front of her, blocking the path. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" he sneered, his eyes narrowing. Evelyn's stomach twisted, but she didn't show it. She held her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," she said calmly, trying to keep her voice steady. Max growled low in his throat, his body stiffening. The dog had a strong sense of who meant harm, and he wasn't pleased by the situation. The man smirked, not moving. Then what's with the attitude? Evelyn took a deep breath. She wasn't going to let this man scare her. "I'm just walking my dog," she said, her voice firm. "Please move out of the way." But the man didn't move. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. Evelyn could feel the tension rising, and she knew that Max wasn't going to stand by quietly for much longer. Evelyn stood still, her hands slightly trembling, but she kept her head high. Max, still at her side, gave a low growl, sensing the rising tension. His protective instincts were kicking in, and Evelyn knew he was ready to defend her if needed. The young man who had stepped in front of her grinned, clearly enjoying the power he felt from blocking her path. He was much taller than Evelyn, and his posture was intimidating. But Evelyn wasn't one to back down easily. She had always prided herself on staying calm and composed in difficult situations, and this was no different. "Come on, old lady," the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's the matter? Don't you want to talk?" Evelyn took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. She didn't want to make the situation worse by getting angry or upset. "I don't want any trouble," she said softly. "I'm just taking my dog for a walk. Please, let me pass." But the man wasn't listening. He moved a little closer, blocking her way even more. His friends were laughing now, as if they thought the whole situation was a joke. Evelyn's stomach turned with unease, but she didn't let it show. Max, on the other hand, wasn't laughing. His eyes were fixed on the man, and his stance had become even more rigid. He stood tall beside Evelyn, his ears pulled back and his mouth slightly open, showing a hint of his teeth. It was a silent warning to anyone who dared to come any closer. The man raised an eyebrow, noticing how Max had reacted. "What's this?" he sneered. "Your dog's gonna protect you now. Don't you think he's a little old for that?" Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the tension building, and she knew she had to be careful. If she said the wrong thing, things could get worse. But she wasn't afraid. She had Max, and she trusted him more than anything. "No," Evelyn said calmly, her voice steady despite the situation. "Max has always been my protector. He doesn't need to prove anything." At that moment, the man took a step forward, and Max moved quickly, placing himself between Evelyn and the man. The dog's stance was strong, and his body was tense with readiness. It was clear that he wasn't going to let anyone get any closer to Evelyn. The group of men fell silent for a moment. They hadn't expected Max to act so confidently. They had probably underestimated the dog, thinking he was just an ordinary pet. But Max was no ordinary dog. He had been trained to protect, and his instincts were sharp. Evelyn looked down at Max, feeling a sense of gratitude and safety wash over her. She knew Max was prepared to do whatever it took to keep her safe, and she felt more confident knowing that he was with her. "Please," Evelyn said, her voice firm but calm. "I don't want any trouble. I just want to finish my walk." The man hesitated, looking at Max with uncertainty in his eyes. He could see the dog wasn't backing down, and it made him think twice. After a long moment of silence, he finally stepped back, waving his friends to follow him. Evelyn let out a sigh of relief as they turned and walked away. Max remained alert, his eyes following the group until they were out of sight. "Good boy, Max," Evelyn whispered, bending down to give him a pat on the head. She felt a deep sense of appreciation for the dog who had not only been her companion, but also her protector when she needed it most. Evelyn stood there for a moment, still catching her breath from the tense encounter. Her heart was pounding, and her mind raced as she watched the group of young men walk away. She felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. The situation had been frightening, but it seemed like they were finally leaving her alone. Max, however, wasn't as relaxed. His ears were still raised, his body stiff, and his eyes scanning the area. It was clear he wasn't convinced the danger had passed. Evelyn reached down to pat him gently on the head, reassuring him. "It's all right, Max. They're gone." But just as she began to take another step, one of the men turned around. Evelyn's eyes widened, and before she could react, the man was running toward her, moving much faster than she had expected. The others followed quickly behind him. The moment they had turned their backs, they had been waiting for the right time to make their move. Max growled loudly, sensing the change in the air. The dog's posture was now more than just protective. He was on full alert. Evelyn barely had time to react before the man was upon her. The first attacker pushed her from behind, making her stumble. Evelyn gasped as she lost her balance, falling onto the soft grass. Max was instantly in motion. With a speed and agility that only a trained dog could possess, he lunged toward the man, his powerful jaws snapping just inches from the man's arm. The young man yelped in surprise, stumbling backward. "Get off me," he shouted, but Max didn't back down. The dog's instincts were in full gear, protecting his owner with everything he had. Evelyn pushed herself to her knees, trying to steady herself as she watched the scene unfold. She could see Max was doing exactly what he was trained to do, but she also knew that the situation was getting out of control. She had to do something. "Max, stay," she commanded as firmly as she could, her voice trembling slightly. She was desperate to keep the situation from escalating any further. Max hesitated for a moment, but then stood tall, his gaze still locked on the men. He wasn't moving, but his protective energy remained just as strong. The men, who had been caught off guard by Max's sudden attack, now looked confused and frightened. They hadn't expected this. They had thought they could intimidate the elderly woman, but they hadn't taken into account Max's past training or his loyalty to Evelyn. One of the men reached into his jacket pocket, and Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She feared they might have weapons, and she wasn't sure how this would end. Max seemed to sense the danger and barked loudly, lunging forward once more, though still under control. At that moment, a loud shout came from behind them. "Hey, what's going on here?" Evelyn looked over and saw a couple of joggers running toward the group. The men froze for a moment, realizing that they were no longer in the clear. The joggers must have seen the confrontation and were coming to help. In the brief moment of confusion, Max, sensing the shift in the situation, moved away from the attackers. The men, now realizing they were not going to win this fight, took one last look at Evelyn and Max before they turned and ran off into the trees. Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps as she stood up, her hands shaking. She looked at Max, who was still standing tall beside her, ready to defend her if needed. "Good boy, Max," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. She was shaken, but she knew she was safe. As the joggers approached, Evelyn felt a wave of relief wash over her. They had seen what happened and were rushing to help. The men had run off into the trees, and the danger seemed to have passed. Still, Evelyn's heart was racing, and her legs felt weak from the shock of the confrontation. She leaned on Max for support, grateful for his calm and protective presence. "Are you okay, Mom?" one of the joggers asked, his voice filled with concern. Evelyn nodded, still trying to catch her breath. "Yes, I'm fine. I'm just shaken up. Thank you for stopping." She looked down at Max, who was standing by her side, his eyes scanning the area to make sure everything was safe. Max's posture was still alert, his ears flicking back and forth as he kept watch. He had been ready to defend her, and his protective instincts were still on high alert, even though the men had run away. Evelyn was proud of him. She had always known that Max was special, but today he had shown just how much he would do for her. "I don't know what would have happened if Max hadn't been here," Evelyn said softly, her voice shaking slightly. She knelt down to give Max a gentle pat on the head. "You saved me, didn't you, boy?" Max looked up at her with his wise brown eyes, as if he understood every word she said. His tail gave a small wag, but he didn't take his eyes off the trees where the men had disappeared. The joggers, still standing nearby, exchanged looks. "We should call the police," one of them suggested. "Those men shouldn't get away with this." Evelyn hesitated for a moment. She didn't want to make a big fuss, but she knew it was important to report what had happened. "You're right," she said. "I'll call them." After making the call to the police, Evelyn felt a little better, knowing that the situation was being handled, but she couldn't shake the image of the men's faces, the way they had treated her, and the way Max had stepped in without hesitation. "I can't believe how brave he is," she murmured, looking at Max again. "I've always known you were special, but today, you were amazing." Max turned his head to look at her, as if acknowledging her words. Evelyn smiled and stood up, feeling a little stronger. The joggers had offered to walk with her to make sure she got home safely, and she appreciated their kindness. They offered her their numbers in case she needed anything. But Evelyn was determined to walk the short distance home on her own. "Thank you both for your help, but I think I'll be okay now," she said, her voice steadier than before. Max, as if understanding the situation, began to walk beside her again, leading the way down the path. His pace was slower now, as though he too was ready to return to a sense of calm. As they reached the park's exit, Evelyn took one last look at the trees where the men had disappeared. She could still feel the tension in the air, but she knew that Max would always be there to protect her, no matter what. With a final glance at the joggers who had helped, Evelyn walked slowly home. The sun was beginning to set as Evelyn walked back to her house, Max trotting proudly beside her. The events of the afternoon were still fresh in her mind, and her thoughts kept returning to the way the men had confronted her and the way Max had stepped in. Her heart still raced from the fear, but with each step, she felt safer knowing Max was at her side. When they arrived home, Evelyn sat down in her cozy living room, Max curling up at her feet. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in the park. The police had called her to check in, and the joggers had also sent her messages to make sure she was okay. The whole situation had shaken her, but there was also a sense of gratitude for the people who had stepped in to help. The next morning, Evelyn woke up to a series of phone calls and messages. News of what had happened in the park had spread quickly through the neighborhood. People had heard about how Max had protected her and how he had scared off the group of young men. The story was all over social media, and soon everyone was talking about the brave dog who had saved his owner from harm. Evelyn was amazed at how quickly things had changed. She hadn't expected so much attention, but at the same time, she was grateful for the support of her community. Many of her neighbors reached out to check on her, offering kind words and support. Some even stopped by to drop off flowers or treats for Max, who had become a local hero in no time. Evelyn smiled as she read through the messages. The community's response was warm and encouraging. People were proud of her for standing up for herself, but they were especially proud of Max. They knew that he had been more than just a dog. He had been a protector, a hero in every sense of the word. One neighbor, Mrs. Harris, who lived a few doors down, sent Evelyn a message that read, "I've always known Max was special, but after what happened, it's clear he's a hero. Please let us know if you need anything, Evelyn. We're all here for you." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears as she read the message. She had always loved her neighbors, but now, in the wake of what had happened, she felt a deep sense of connection and support. The people around her were showing that they cared, and that meant more than anything. Max, sensing her emotions, lifted his head and placed it gently in her lap. Evelyn stroked his fur, feeling the comfort of his presence. She was grateful for him, not just for his bravery, but for his loyalty and love. Later that week, a small ceremony was held in the park to honor Max for his heroic actions. The local police department even made an appearance, recognizing Max's service as a retired police dog. They awarded him a special certificate of bravery, and Evelyn was touched by the gesture. The whole neighborhood gathered to celebrate Max and the bond he shared with Evelyn. It was a reminder that sometimes, even in difficult times, people come together to show kindness and support. As the day came to a close, Evelyn looked around at the smiling faces of her neighbors and felt a deep sense of peace. Max had not only protected her, but had also brought the community closer together. "Thank you, Max," Evelyn whispered, her heart full of gratitude. She knew that no matter what challenges the future might bring, they would face them together as a team. The small ceremony in the park had been a beautiful moment for Evelyn and Max, but it also opened up new conversations about Max's past. As word spread about the courageous dog who had protected his owner, many people in the neighborhood became curious about his history. Everyone knew Max was special, but few knew just how extraordinary he was. Evelyn had always been open about adopting Max from the rescue shelter, but she had never fully shared the details of his past life as a police dog. She had been waiting for the right time to tell the story, and now, with the community so curious and supportive, it felt like the perfect moment. One afternoon, a reporter from the local newspaper came to Evelyn's house to ask her about the events at the park. They wanted to write a story about Max's bravery, and Evelyn agreed to meet with her. She invited the reporter into her living room, where Max was lounging on the rug, his eyes watching her carefully as she spoke. "I'm glad you're here," Evelyn said, taking a seat on the couch. "Max has been through a lot, and I think it's important that people know just how much he's given." The reporter nodded and smiled, noticing how close the two were. "I've heard so many wonderful things about Max," she said. "I think everyone in the neighborhood is talking about him. I'd love to hear his full story." Evelyn took a deep breath and began to tell the reporter about Max's time as a police dog. She spoke of how he had been part of the K-9 unit for several years, working alongside officers to help with searches and apprehending criminals. Max had been trained to detect drugs, track suspects, and even protect his fellow officers. His skills were unmatched, and he had saved many lives during his time on the force. But Max's career had come to an end after an injury during a dangerous chase. Evelyn explained that the injury wasn't serious enough to stop him from being adopted, but it had meant that Max could no longer serve in the police force. Despite his retirement, Evelyn could tell that Max still had that strong sense of duty and responsibility. "He's always been so protective," Evelyn explained. "Even when he was just a puppy, you could tell that he wanted to look after those around him. When I adopted him, I knew he was special, but I didn't realize just how much he had already given to the world." The reporter listened carefully, her eyes softening as she understood more about Max's past. She could see how much he meant to Evelyn, not just as a dog, but as a loyal companion who had given everything for others. "We're all so lucky to have him here now," the reporter said, smiling. "He's a true hero, and it's clear that he's still ready to protect the people he loves." The article that followed was filled with warmth and admiration for both Max and Evelyn. It shared his story as a police dog and highlighted his bravery in the park. People in the community read the article with pride, and Max became even more beloved. As for Evelyn, she was grateful for the chance to share Max's story. She realized that not only had Max saved her, but he had also reminded everyone in their neighborhood of the importance of loyalty, bravery, and kindness. Max, with his simple yet extraordinary heart, had become more than just a hero. He had become a symbol of hope for the entire community. Weeks passed since the incident in the park, and life slowly returned to normal for Evelyn and Max. But something had changed in the neighborhood. People seemed to be kinder, more connected, and more willing to help one another. The bond between Evelyn and Max had always been strong, but now it felt even deeper, like they were both symbols of resilience and strength for everyone around them. Evelyn had always been an active part of the community, but now, after Max's bravery had been shared with the world, she found that people were more open and supportive than ever. Neighbors who had once been distant now waved at her on the street, stopping for small chats and asking about Max. The local store owners often greeted her with smiles, and many offered Max treats when they saw him walking by. He had truly become a hero in their eyes, not just for his courage, but for the kindness and loyalty he represented. Max, of course, was unaware of the attention. He continued to live his life just as he always had, loyal, loving, and protective. He enjoyed his daily walks with Evelyn, often stopping to greet the children in the neighborhood, who now saw him not just as a dog, but as a friend and protector. But the real change, Evelyn realized, was in the way people began to treat each other. The event in the park had shaken something loose in their hearts. In the face of fear and uncertainty, they had seen the power of standing together and protecting one another. People were beginning to show more compassion, understanding that kindness could make a difference in times of trouble. Evelyn and Max became symbols of this newfound unity. They were often invited to local events, and Max was celebrated as the hero dog who had brought the community together. At one gathering, the mayor of the town even gave Max a special certificate of bravery, recognizing him not just for his role in the park incident, but for the love and courage he had brought into people's lives. Despite the recognition, Evelyn remained humble. She was proud of Max, of course, but she always reminded others that it wasn't just about the incident. It was about the quiet ways Max had always been there for her and others, offering comfort and protection without expecting anything in return. As for the young men who had confronted her in the park, they never returned. The incident had taught them a lesson about respect and the power of unexpected strength. Evelyn never saw them again, but she knew that the lesson they had learned would stay with them for a long time. Now, whenever Evelyn and Max went for their walks, they were no longer just a woman and her dog. They were a reminder that even in difficult times, goodness could rise, and people could come together to make their world a better place. The simple acts of kindness, like the ones Max had shown that day, rippled out, making the world just a little bit brighter. Evelyn smiled as she watched Max run ahead, his tail wagging happily. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She was lucky to have such a wonderful companion by her side. Together, they had overcome something challenging, and together they would face whatever came next, with courage, love, and an unbreakable bond.